on this computer. And the recording has started.
Absolutely. Kevin, man, how are you, man? How you doing today?
I'm good. It's good to meet you. Good to see your face. We've only talked by phone, so I appreciate you guys having me.
Yeah.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. We appreciate you giving us the opportunity to speak with you. Come on and educate the people. I know last time we was talking, you was jumping in the truck, had some trouble with the Bluetooth, and now we're here, we're settled, man.
Yes, hopefully I kicked everybody out of my house so nobody can disturb me.
Definitely.
Well, I have a 10-year-old. I didn't kick him out, but I did let him know to leave me alone. So hopefully we don't have any trouble.
That's good. That's good.
Certainly.
Maurice, how are you doing, sir?
I'm living the dream. How about you?
No complaints, man. No complaints at all.
That's good. Well, for go ahead, Gerard.
No. So Kevin, obviously we've had you on. We're bringing you on so you can give us a little bit of insight about homelessness. Prior to you doing that, would you mind just giving us a little bit about your background, how you became to work with strategies for the homeless and whatnot?
Okay. I mean, I'm a native Cincinnati. I haven't been here most of my life. So I took my first job working with the homeless all the way back in 1998. So I've been working on this issue that long. That job was as a street outreach worker, going out on the street and working with homeless teenagers who were on the street. That's a program that's still around, but it's part of Lighthouse Youth and Family Services now.
I love Lighthouse. In fact, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt. In fact, I'm on the board of the Cincinnati College Preparatory Academy with Bob Meekum, the former president.
Are you really?
Yeah. So
I was really on a Zoom call with Bob Meekum just earlier today. So
well, there you go.
It's good to see him.
Yeah, very connected. City is very
right.
connected.
Cincinnati's a very small town. So anyway, I started out doing street outreach, and eventually sort of. What I saw when I was doing street outreach is there wasn't necessarily a lot of coordination among the agencies that worked with the homeless. So I started my current organization, Strategies to End Homelessness, in 2007. And our job is to do that sort of system coordination. So we're kind of behind the scenes coordinating what about 30 different organizations are doing. Those 30 organizations are the ones who actually run the homeless shelters, run the street outreach programs, run the housing programs, all that sort of thing. But we're kind of in the background helping coordinate all that work.
What are some of those organizations?
I mean, you name them. Most of them are not necessary. So some of them are known specifically for serving the homeless. So Shelter House, Bethany House, Tender Mercies. But some of those 30 organizations, they do lots of other stuff, and maybe it's not as well understood that they also run programs for the homeless. So the Free Store Food Bank, Talbert House, the YWCA of Greater Cincinnati, those are also organizations that we work with. And they obviously do lots of other stuff as well, but thankfully, they also run programs that are specifically for people who have been homeless. And that's the part of their work that we partner with them on.
Okay.
What does it look like for you to coordinate between, let's say, a YWC or a Talbert House or any of those organizations?
And before you answer that one, I got a question. Can you tell us now, homelessness? When I think of homelessness, I think of someone living literally on the street, right? Can you give us a definition of what homelessness is in relation to your organization?
Well, I would imagine that so the biggest funder of homeless services is the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And most of the data that we have on homelessness sort of follows who HUD thinks is homeless.
Okay.
So HUD essentially thinks people are homeless if they're in one of three situations.
Really quickly, hold on, I'm sorry. Can you tell us what HUD is?
The Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Okay.
So they're a part of the federal government. They're the big funder of homeless services. So most of the money that goes into the system is coming all the way from the federal government. It's not like city or county money or something local. Most of it comes from the feds. And the Department of Housing and Urban Development considers somebody to be homeless if they're sleeping inside one of our homeless shelters. So they're a resident of a shelter. They're on the streets, or, HUD refers to it as sleeping in a place not meant for human habitation. The shorthand for that is on the streets.
Gotcha.
And the third one is they're fleeing domestic violence. So on the street, in a shelter, fleeing domestic violence. So that's who would really be considered homeless.
Okay.
In terms of, or literally homeless, maybe is another way of thinking of it.
Okay.
So what that coordination looks like, back when I was doing street outreach, part of the reason I started my organization was what I noticed was that a lot of the agencies didn't really talk to each other all that frequently. And therefore, the different shelters weren't necessarily coordinating their efforts, doing things that complemented each other, that sort of thing. And also, sometimes you had multiple agencies offering homeless people the exact same service. And meanwhile, there was some other service that homeless people needed that no one was providing. So what we try to do is make sure that not only are the programs the different agencies are running, not only do they complement each other, but that we also aren't leaving like big gaps in the system that no one is filling. I think a perfect example is back when I was doing street outreach. Mine was the only street outreach program in Hamilton County, and I was only supposed to work with people up to age 25. So what was I supposed to do when I ran into a 60-year-old sleeping in Burnett Woods or something like that, which did happen? Well, now we have 4 street outreach programs that serve all kinds of people so that there is someone out there who can help anybody who might be on the street.
Wow. Okay.
So we try to make sure that gaps like that get filled as well.
Okay. All right.
So with that being said, Kevin, what else can you tell us, like just some of your experiences with homelessness over the years that have been troubling or challenging that you've dealt with?
Well, I spend a lot of time dispelling myths about sort of who is homeless. So like
that was actually going to be a question I had about
yeah, I mean, something I struggle with all the time is, people want me to tell them about how homeless people are all drug addicts. And I have to be like, hold on, only about a quarter of homeless people have a drug or alcohol problem. And then people are like, oh, you mean the other 75%, they're all mentally ill, right? And I have to be like, no, less than 40% have a mental illness. So, the average homeless person is not mentally ill. The average homeless person does not have a substance abuse issue. And typically people are not homeless for any of the reasons that people tend to assume. Mainly people are homeless because they can't afford housing. It's really just as simple as that. And it's the fact that, they can't afford housing or they're overextended paying for their housing. That's why people are at risk of becoming homeless to begin with.
Gotcha.
I have a question. So what do you say about the people who, let's say, I'm always coming down 75, jumping off of exit 6, East Mitchell, and there's a homeless guy, right? Always there, man. We're starting to become buddies, man. But what do you say about people who, there's sometimes this myth that those people aren't homeless or they can go find jobs in this economy. They can go work at McDonald's. What do you have to say about that, if anything?
Well, I can't necessarily speak to, whether or not they have the skills to get a job or something like that. But I can tell you that actually most of them are not homeless.
They're not homeless?
Not homeless. So we had the street outreach workers, the very street outreach workers I was talking about a minute ago, go out and survey all the people who were out panhandling, holding signs, asking for money and all that kind of stuff. We did this maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago.
Okay.
And by those people's own report, only 1/3 of them were homeless.
1/3 were
typically,
homeless.
Yes. Typically, what is written on the sign the person is holding when they're asking for money at the end of the exit ramp or whatever, it's a marketing campaign. It is targeted at bringing in as much money as possible, and people find that they receive more money if they say they're homeless, if they say they're a veteran, if they say they just lost their job, that sort of thing. Very often, none of those things are true. Now, that does not mean that that person doesn't have some very real problems and that they don't need help. All it means is that the problems described on the sign they're holding are not necessarily the actual problems that they are dealing with. So actually, most of the people that are out panhandling like that are not homeless. To go one step further, most homeless people, at least locally, have never spent a single night on the street. They every night that they've been homeless, they've been in a shelter. So people tend to look at that person at the end of the highway exit ramp, and they think that that is an appropriate representation of who is homeless. But not only is that person, if they are homeless, they're representing only about 13% of our homeless population that sleeps on the street at all. But they also, more likely, they're not even homeless.
Wow.
So, but that doesn't change the fact that people tend to think that that is who is homeless. The average homeless person is, moms with kids that are in one of our family shelters, or people that have extensive work histories but fell on a bad string of luck and ended up sleeping in one of our shelters. That's what homelessness really looks like.
Yes. So Kevin, so speaking of this talk, can you talk a little bit about the article that Lucy May did today, titled "Homeless Families in Greater Cincinnati Are Struggling to Find Stability During COVID-19 Crisis"? Hopefully that's a good leeway into.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So we have 4 family shelters that are open year-round in Hamilton County. So the YWCA, the Salvation Army, the Interfaith Hospitality Network, and Bethany House. Those are our 4 year-round family shelters. But many of their buildings are congregate buildings where you might even have more than one family sleeping in the same room together. So when COVID-19 came along, we looked at some of these shelters and thought, my God, if a case of COVID-19 walks into one of these shelters, everybody's going to get it. So what the family shelters did is they completely closed some of their congregate buildings and moved all those families out into hotel and motel rooms so that each family could have its own distinct space separated from each other. Hopefully that would prevent people from getting the virus, but if one family did get the virus, that it wouldn't spread to all the other families. So right now we have about 55 families that are staying in hotel rooms so that they're not stacked on top of each other in these congregate facilities. At the same time, some of the single shelters like the City Gospel Mission and Shelter House, they had people, in bunk beds that were 3 feet apart. So that, people were way too close together. So they moved out some of their most elderly and sick people who would be most susceptible to the virus into hotel and motel rooms, which allowed those people who were at high risk to not be in the shelter, but then allowed the people who are still in the shelters to spread out a little bit and have a little bit more distance. So we've kind of had to stand the shelter system on its head a little bit to be prepared for the COVID-19 virus. So far, so good. We haven't had a single case in one of the shelters yet.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
We had Jenny Berg on last week, and she was kind of talking to us about nonprofits. And if I'm not mistaken, YWCA, Talbot House, those are some of the nonprofits, right? With the budget cuts that are suspected to come, do you have any idea how you all expect to handle some of the homelessness programs that these organizations offer?
It's going to be a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of the impact. So, for example, we oversee homelessness prevention services with 4 other agencies, and our homelessness prevention services got cut by 25% by the city. But at the same time, the state received some homelessness prevention money that they are sending a chunk of it to us in Hamilton County that will sort of replace that money. But we're lucky that, what we are being cut in local funding for homelessness prevention is somewhat being replaced by state dollars. But many of the things that are being cut by the city are not eligible for any of the COVID-19. I mean, these dollars coming down from the state, it's all COVID-19 related money. And some of those projects just are not eligible for those kinds of dollars. So some of them are going to get a very drastic cut very quickly with no guarantee that their money will ever go back up.
You mentioned when you and I spoke, and we talked a little bit about how there were about 7,000 cases last year of homelessness in Cincinnati. Can you speak to where that number is last time you were informed? And also, if you have any idea where you expect that number to be after COVID settles down, or even when it does?
So what, homelessness locally has remained relatively stable over the last 5 years. Okay. So, and again, I'm talking about people on the street, in shelters, or fleeing domestic violence. It has, I'll give you a perfect example. We had 7,025 homeless people in 2015, and we had 7,079 people last year in 2019. Yep. So like literally a difference of like 50 people. So it has been relatively flat, but we are expecting to see a big uptick this year due to COVID-19. What seems to be happening is that, where most people are before they become literally homeless is they're doubled up. They're sleeping on a friend's couch. They're sleeping in, a friend's basement or something like that. What seems to be happening is that lots of people that are in those doubled up situations, whoever's letting them sleep on the couch is looking at them thinking, that's somebody who might bring the virus into my house. Get out. Yeah. So people seem to be getting kicked out at a faster rate than would normally be the case.
What is the normal rate?
So that's one factor. It's hard to say because we don't have great data on all those people out there sleeping on couches, because until they sort of come in for some sort of service, we don't know where they are and we can't really count them.
Gotcha.
The other thing that's going on that, there's a first part that most people aren't aware of, and then it's sort of come early with COVID-19. We normally see an increase in family homelessness during the summer. It's what the family shelters refer to as the summer surge. That a lot of time, if a mom and her kids are, sleeping on their friend's floor or something like that, that sort of arrangement stays together as long as the kids are getting up and going to school every day. But as soon as school gets out for the summer and all of a sudden those kids are underfoot all day, whoever's letting mom and her kids sleep on the floor kicks her out. So we always see an uptick in family homelessness during the summer. Well, essentially summer break came early with COVID-19 and all the schools closed.
March 15th, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, summertime in March came. So like that is something that happens every year, but it doesn't normally happen at this time of year. It doesn't normally happen until the end of May. But I think we're also seeing a certain amount of that because of the schools being closed.
What does work look like for you now, man? I'm pretty sure you're busy, right? So what does work look like for you now during this time?
Well, it looks like my dining room that I'm sitting at.
Right.
Since we are, again, we're kind of behind the scenes.
Yeah.
I view it as our goal to make sure that all of the partner agencies have the resources they need to actually help the people who are homeless. So, but we are not a direct service organization. So our office is closed. Everybody's working from home. We have been for 5 weeks now. But since we're not where the rubber meets the road, we're not operating the shelter, that's not necessarily problematic for us. Our partner agencies, I mean, the Greater Cincinnati behavioral health people who are out still doing street outreach under bridges with homeless people, and Lighthouse and all the shelter operators that have hundreds of people in front of them every day who could have the virus. I mean, they are doing amazing work to just keep the shelters open, because that's where it's really hard right now in the system.
So I guess what I'm asking is, has anything changed on a day-to-day basis as far as operations with you? Has anything changed now that COVID is here? Are you operating any differently aside from your workspace?
Us or in the system? I mean, the hotel change of so many of the shelters moving people out to hotels, I would tell you, is probably the biggest change that has had to happen within the whole system. There are other things happening that they're good, but they are it's sort of unfortunate this is how it came about. So like all of a sudden, there's a lot more resources for eviction prevention, because obviously there are lots of people who are going to be facing eviction in the next couple months. So all of a sudden, we're able to get a lot more resources for eviction prevention. Kind of sad that this had to happen for there to be resources available to help people not get evicted. We also oversee something that's called shelter diversion. That's people who are already sleeping on their buddy's couch, and their buddy is starting to tell them, you got to be out by next week or something like that. And their next stop is going to be a shelter. Those shelter diversion programs can help that person get back into their own housing rather than coming into a shelter. We have also gotten some increased funding to do that sort of thing.
Okay.
But again, these are all COVID-19 related dollars. And, you know, we don't have any idea how long that money will stay around. We're doing good things with that money, but who knows how long it'll last or whether or not there'll be any more of it.
You said one thing about the money that you all are getting for, or the help that you're getting for eviction prevention. I know you also mentioned how much easier it is to prevent someone from becoming homeless to bring them, or than it is to bring them up out of homelessness. Can you kind of speak to why that is?
Well, it's easier in part because it's so much cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, like St. Vincent de Paul is one of the biggest organizations in town for helping people get caught up on their rent.
Yes.
So that's a form of eviction prevention. Well, you know, the last time I asked St. Vincent de Paul what their normal amount of money it takes to do that, they told me $200. So $200 if you intervene while a person is still in an apartment but behind on their rent. If you allow that person to get into a doubled up situation where now they want to get into one of those shelter diversion programs I was just telling you about, where they're already on their buddy's couch, their next stop is a shelter. At that point, it costs us about $1,200 per person to keep that person from becoming homeless. If they become homeless, the average cost to the system of a person who actually becomes homeless is about $4,000.
Wow.
So, I mean, so prevention is just the reason it's so much easier in part is because it's so much easier. You can help, you know, 5 families with $1,000 if you're helping them catch up on their rent. You can't even help one person in shelter diversion with $1,000, and that's only a quarter of the cost of helping somebody once they're already in shelter. So part of it is just costs so much less if you intervene earlier.
And and you know, you compare that to the healthcare system, right? You know, prevention is the key. You talk about,
it's the same thing.
Yeah, same thing. Prevention is the key. Once a person gets really sick, you know, it's kind of like, well, what are some things we can do to prevent that thing? You talk about the opioid, you know, crisis. You talk about some of these other things. You know, prevention is the key. So, and apparently it's the same kind of thing with you know, homelessness.
But how about this? This is like the kind of stuff that I bang my head on this wall all the time. So the federal government, Department of Housing and Urban Development, gives Hamilton County about $25 million a year for homeless services.
Okay.
Zero of those dollars go into prevention. So like, and that's just because the federal government gives us the money in different like buckets of, they put it in different buckets. And, you know, there's a bucket that pays to operate homeless shelters, and there's a bucket that pays to operate housing programs, you know, like Tender Mercies and places like that. And there is a bucket for prevention, but it basically doesn't have any money in it. So, and we're not allowed to pick up any of the $25 million and put it into the prevention bucket. So, you know, something that's just ridiculous about trying to do what I do is that our federal government isn't really helping us because they won't put any of the money where we could get the most bang for our buck.
Right.
What can the people do to to advocate for that? Like, what can be done?
And that was my,
that?
and that was my next. That was exactly the question I was going to ask. You know, you talk about the city, you know, cutting funding by 25%. Obviously, with COVID-19, that's been able to be replaced. But we know that the city has been facing a budget deficit for a long time, right? And so over the years, things have kind of got cut out, and you know, you kind of wonder what are the next things going to get cut. Also, the county. So I guess another question I want to ask is, how does the county support your organization in homelessness?
So, you know, our tagline is, you know, prevent, assist, solve. And the way I think of that is, okay, we want to prevent as many people from becoming homeless as we can. We want to assist the people who are already homeless. And then the solve part is we want to offer solutions to homelessness through housing. So the way that $25 million that I just talked about plays out, and these are not all federal government dollars, it's other sources as well, is we've got about $1 million that we can put into prevention. That's not federal government money. We've got about $1 million in prevention. We've got about $4 million that operates the homeless shelters and helps people who are homeless today. And then we've got about $20 million that goes into housing programs for which people had to already be homeless to get into one of those housing programs. So, you know, ideally what we would do is just pick up some portion of the 20 million that's in the housing programs and put it in prevention. That's what we would need to do. But it literally would require an act of Congress, because Congress has passed legislation that sort of dictated that these were how the dollars flowed, and it would take an act of Congress to change that. Now, what we do, because all the money is in the housing programs, we're always trying to find money for other parts of the system. So the Hamilton County very generously, $1.8 million a year of the $4 million that goes into shelters. So almost half of it comes from Hamilton County.
Oh, wow. That's
and
amazing.
about $400,000 of the $1 million that does go into prevention comes from the city.
Okay.
And the United Way also funds prevent. So we're constantly trying to find resources to help the people who are homeless today and to do more prevention, specifically because there's just not a lot of resources there compared to all the money that is already available for the housing programs. And that doesn't even give us too many housing programs, but just that's where most of the money is.
So what can a layman's person like myself and Gerard, what can we do to help support? Like what can I, because oftentimes, you know, I've read articles that has told me to, you know, not give to a person on the highway. If I want to see what I give work more, is to donate to, you know, donate to the Free Stroke Food Bank, donate to an organization like yours, because you all do the work to help support homelessness in our region. What can a person like me do? Myself and Gerard.
You'll have to unmute him. Yeah.
Oh, I think you muted. Unmute.
Yeah.
Sorry, Kevin. 1 second.
Okay, I'm good now.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry. I had to cough, so I muted myself.
Oh,
I
okay.
didn't realize that I couldn't unmute myself. So
sorry.
And I lost your question there. What can the average person do to help?
Yeah.
You know, there are a couple of things that come to mind. I mean, first of all, I always advocate, again, the people who are homeless are not the stereotypes of homeless.
Of course.
Homelessness. So it's always good for people to actually get out and meet people who have been so unfortunate as to find themselves in homelessness. So right off the bat, I would say volunteer is the first thing people can do, because volunteering does two things. One, it gives people an accurate idea of who is actually homeless, and it's not what stereotypes would tell them. But the second thing it does is there's a very literal translation between, you know, if a homeless shelter has to pay someone to serve meals, then that's money they can't use to move a homeless person back into an apartment. So if somebody shows up and if a volunteer shows up and serves the meal, that frees up dollars that shelters can literally use to move a homeless person back into housing. So it's that basic. So, I mean, the first thing is to volunteer. The second thing, obviously everybody and their brother says you could donate money, but, I always think people need to be strategic if they're going to donate money. I just explained how there's very little resource for prevention. There's lots of money for other things. Like, people should do a little research before they write a check and make sure that they're not writing a check to support something that there's already plenty of money to support, when there are other things where the money could really, really make an impact. So,
and in other words, restrict the funds to what it is that really needs that impact.
Just know what you're supporting. Like, I always tell people, if you really want to have an impact when you make a donation, donate to something preventative. Because Maurice, you just made the argument that, whether you're talking about healthcare or whatever, prevention is so much cheaper.
Yeah.
God loves somebody who wanted to donate $1,000. They could basically keep a person from being homeless if they did it in prevention. But if they donated elsewhere, the person might already be there, and we might need their donation and several other people's donations to get that person back out.
Gotcha.
Just like, know where the resources are and donate accordingly.
That's very one before you go, Gerard. I really appreciate you stating that, because I can tell you many people who may view this as we're recording. I can assure you many of them are unaware of the impact they can have if they do the things that you speak about. So I truly thank you for enlightening us, because I can tell you, even I know we've had our conversation prior to this, but I'm kind of being blown away as we talk about this, and considering the COVID-19 here as well.
I appreciate you saying that, and I just hope that sometimes when we get down into the weeds of talking about dollars, I watch people glaze over. So I appreciate you guys being interested in that.
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead, Rock.
$200 is what St. Vincent de Paul. I just want to emphasize that is what St. Vincent de Paul can typically use to help someone catch up on their rent. So if you donate $1,000, that's 5 families that you're helping.
The last time I asked Mike Dunn, the executive director of St. Vincent de Paul, like, what the average amount is that they give somebody who's behind on their rent to keep them from losing their apartment, he told me $200. So, I mean, people can have a significant impact. And sometimes that's not even just one person. Like, that might be a family that's behind on their rent. So you might not just be helping one adult. You might be helping that person's children as well never have to go down the spiral of instability that comes later if they do lose their apartment.
Perfect segue. I knew you was gonna throw me the alley-oop, Kevin. So, as you were talking
segue
about,
to what? I don't even know what we're segueing to.
I got you. Don't worry about it. So, as you're talking about the family, right, that is impacted by homelessness, I kind of want to get to some of the children. I know you were a street outreach coordinator. I know earlier we spoke about how 25% of children in Cincinnati account for the homelessness population. Can you kind of speak to what that spiral looks like, just from some of your experience? If you have any stories you want to share, anything of that nature.
Well, people tend, again, myths. People tend to think that the average homeless person is some guy in his 40s or 50s or 60s, maybe somebody about my age, that has an alcohol problem or something like that, and that's who's homeless. But, when you think about the fact that in Hamilton County, Ohio, 1 out of every 4 homeless people is a child, like, that just sort of dispels that myth of it being all like 50-somethings. At the same time, there's another 9% that are under the age of 25. So more than a third of our homeless population, with the children and the 18 to 24-year-olds, more than a third of our homeless people are under the age of 25. So, like, I had somebody recently ask me, how do kids go from being in school and having a stable life to being adults that are on the street? And I said, you can't assume that kids ever had a stable life. Because with that many young people that are in homelessness, the reality is those are people who never got a good start in life, and the deck is sort of stacked against them. The family shelters, one of the things that I know sort of bothers some of the family shelters the most is that they'll have, a 25-year-old mom come through the shelter with her, 8-year-old daughter. And then 10 years later, here comes the 8-year-old daughter with her own baby. And it's like generational that you see these kids who get a bad start in life and who are experiencing homelessness when they're kids. Well, guess what? A lot of times they're the adults coming back into the system later. It's like there's this whole population of people who never really got a good start. So homelessness is disproportionately affecting young people, not old people. And, I worked with kids, back when I was doing street outreach, I worked with kids as young as 14 who were living on the streets, no parent with them, no adult or guardian in sight, 14-year-old living on the street, sleeping in vacant buildings, things like that. And that is still unfortunately happening.
And can you speak a little bit to and I've read, and just enlighten me if I'm not speaking correctly, but the LGBTQ community, homelessness, does that disproportionately affect that community as well?
Very much so. And that tends to be in that young group. We tend to see a lot of people in the population of young homeless people who somewhat, when they came out to their parents or disclosed to their parents, they got kicked out. And did not have family members that were willing to be supportive. So while it's definitely, especially at like the shelters that are run by Lighthouse Youth and Family Services, they have 2 shelters, and they specifically see a very disproportionately high number of LGBTQ youth who are coming into their facilities. So that's definitely a risk factor.
All right. So with that being said, with the youth, I remember there was a time that I was with Zoo Mates, and it was a program at the University of Cincinnati that actually helped go into schools and homeless kids. I had a kid, Mike, who was about 14, and he was homelessness. I recently seen him at the DMV, and he had just got out of jail. So I can definitely understand that impact of us being able to help people who are homeless, because desperate times calls for desperate measures, so to speak, man. So I appreciate you touching on that for us for sure.
Well, and sometimes the things that led to people getting locked up was they got locked up for being homeless. They got picked up for trespassing. They got picked up for all sorts of stuff like that. And they were, homeless. Being homeless shouldn't be a crime, but that sometimes makes the situation worse.
No, this was unfortunately an aggravated assault. So I just want to speak to how much impact that your company can have, and some of the companies that you work with, or some of the organizations that you work with, can have on kind of steering these people or giving stability to some of these people, some of that importance, man. So I definitely know I appreciate that and the work that you're doing, man, to help out.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Again, it's somewhat unfortunate, like, when someone comes out of prison or out of jail, again, in order to qualify to be considered homeless, you have to already be on the street in a shelter or fleeing domestic violence. So one problem that we have is that sometimes people who are returning from prison and who are wanting to make a fresh start now that they're back out, and that, we can't, they're among the group of people that we can't offer much support to, because there aren't a lot of resources to prevent them from ending up on the street or in a shelter. And the resources that aren't available, they don't qualify for until they are on the street or in a shelter. And some people, before they end up on the street or in a shelter, might commit another offense to try to stay out of homelessness. So, if we could do more to help people who were at risk but not yet homeless, then we could also potentially be helping people not reoffend, not go back into prison, so many things like that.
Right.
It all sort of ties together. I am glad that these programs that we oversee, they do take people with felonies. They do take people with histories. It's not like people are getting turned away from these programs because they made a mistake in the past, which is a good thing. It's just unfortunate that we have to wait until they're already homeless to help them.
Yeah.
So
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Rod. I'll get you after. Go ahead, Gerard.
So I'm just trying to process this in my mind. So what it looks like, a guy's coming home. There's no way that you can know prior to him or her coming home from prison whether or not they'll have a place to stay. So now they have to enter society again and then kind of find resources to actually place them in a homeless shelter in order for you to actually reach them and be able to help them. Is that accurate?
Well, I mean, there are resources to help people get into a shelter. I mean, shelters, it should not be difficult for people to get into a shelter. In a perfect world.
Is it difficult?
Well, for families, it's harder. So the dynamic is a little strange. Families are more likely to have someone willing to let them sleep on their floor or something like that because they feel bad for the kids. But there are more families who end up staying in those situations because they can't get into one of the family shelters. So if we have a gap in terms of shelter, it's that we don't have enough capacity for families. Bethany House right now is trying to build a new building that would give it a significantly more capacity, which would help all of the family shelters, not just Bethany House. So that would help fix it, but that facility is probably at least a couple years down the road. Okay. On the singles side, we benefit greatly as a community from having Shelter House operating here in Cincinnati because
and if I'm not mistaken, that's right across from United Way. Is that correct?
Well, they have two buildings. Their women's building is right across the street from the United Way.
And the Louis Inn, right?
No, the Ann Louise Inn is housing. Right next door, across the parking lot from the Ann Louise Inn, is the Hatton Center for Women. That is a 80-bed women's homeless shelter. Okay. And then they also have the Barron Center for Men, which is over on Guest Street in Queensgate. Those are their two buildings, one for women, one for men. Okay. The great thing about Shelter House is they don't stick to a fixed capacity. They will expand to meet the need as much as they possibly can. And because they are such a great resource for our community and they're willing to expand in that way, it's easier for singles to get into a shelter. Gotcha. It's a little harder for families. So, Gerard, what I was saying about returning citizens, people coming back from prison, is not necessarily that they would have trouble getting into a shelter. It's that there wouldn't be many resources to help them before it was necessary for them to go to a shelter. Like, I would love to be able to, if we had unlimited prevention dollars, then anybody who came out of prison and found themselves at risk of being homeless, we could help them. But we don't we hardly have any prevention dollars. So when I say that we can't help them until they're already homeless, it's because once they enter a shelter, then our federal government and the Department of Housing and Urban Development consider them to be eligible for the programs that they fund.
Okay. Now, does HUD have restrictions, and correct me if I'm wrong, like as far as Section 8 or something of that nature, right? Or does HUD have restrictions for felons?
The Department of Housing and Urban Development is huge, and there are a lot of different parts to it. So the Section 8 program and Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority is a part of HUD, and they have housing buildings that they own and operate. That's a different part of HUD than what I'm talking about. The part of HUD that we work with is programs that are specifically for homeless people. Okay. So what we typically do if a person is homeless and we can get them into one of these housing programs, most of these programs are actually helping them lease an apartment from a landlord somewhere out in the community. Gotcha. Okay. And the agency running the housing program is doing home visits and checking up on them and making sure they're getting connected to the services they need and all that kind of stuff. But what it typically looks like is they're just in a regular old apartment somewhere out in the community. Gotcha. There are a few exceptions to that. Organizations like Tender Mercies are what we call site-based, where they have a building and everybody living in the building is a part of the program. Okay. But most of the programs that we oversee, it's just some landlord out in the community who rents to the person, and our program helps out with the rent and the services for a period of time. Going back to something, Maurice, that you asked me earlier as to what people can do. One of the problems with all the stereotypes about homeless people, and like that stereotype that they're all drug addicts, is, there are tons and tons of people out there in the community, landlords, people who own rental property, who won't rent to somebody as soon as they hear that they have been homeless, because they assume that means they're mentally ill. They assume that means they have a drug and alcohol problem. If we could just get landlords to not make those assumptions and to be willing to rent apartments to people who have been homeless, then it would be much easier to get people out of the shelters and back into housing. But, landlords are people too, and they buy into those stereotypes the same way as other people, and that presents problems.
Wow, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate you saying that. And on your website, which I'm going to share the screen here in a second, if you could talk a little bit, we were talking about families as well. If you could talk a little bit about on your website, you said it says learn how you can help at nofamilyhomeless.org. If you could talk a little bit about that, and then finally to wrap up, because we're getting close on time, if you could talk about how the impact that you think COVID-19 is going to have in a year from so. If you could talk a little bit about that. I'm going to share the screen now.
Okay. So nofamilyhomeless.org is a website. So I mentioned that what we do is we get organizations to collaborate with each other. So the 4 family shelters that I mentioned before, Bethany House, Interfaith Hospitality Network, YWCA, and Salvation Army, they work very, very closely together to try to make sure that every family that is homeless in our community gets what they need. So that website is something that we put up for them, nofamilyhomeless.org. And what we do is, if people want to know that their donation is going to go specifically to help families, then they could go through that website and we would know these are dollars that the person intended specifically to help families. So it's basically a simple way that people can know that that's where their dollars would go.
That's awesome.
Perfect.
And the dollars will go to those 4 agencies and to help them do what they're doing in terms of helping families.
And that is Bethany House, Interfaith Hospitality Network of Greater Cincinnati, Salvation Army, and YWCA of Greater Cincinnati.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
In terms of the long-term impact of COVID, that was the second part of your question. Homelessness, I'm not even most concerned about the impact of COVID-19 right now. Okay. I'm really most concerned about what's going to be happening a year from now, and let me explain to you why. The typical progression people go through to ending up literally homeless looks something like this. They, for some reason or another, they lose their own housing, they get evicted, something like that. Then they begin a cycle where they are moving through every friend and family member who is willing to let them stay with them. And they manage to stay out of the shelters and off the streets for however long they can piece together, couches or floors to sleep on. And it's not until they run out of couches and floors to sleep on that they end up coming into a shelter or being on the street. That typically takes at least a year. So some of the wheels that are being put in motion by COVID-19 right now, people who are unable to work, that's going to lead to people getting evicted in May, June, July, August. Then they're going to begin sleeping on people's couches, friends and family. That's going to take several more months. So really, when we might see the increase in homelessness from COVID-19 is really more like a year and a half from now. The problem is all the resources targeted toward COVID-19 will all have dried up and gone away by then. And everybody's going to be trying to forget that this ever happened by then. But that's when the homeless system potentially could really be getting unloaded on by people who are, they've been trying for a year to sort of get back on their feet. But, and many people will get back on their feet during that year, but there will be some number of people who can't. And so I really think it's 2021 when we are potentially going to see a big uptick in homelessness, because it's just going to take a while for that all to happen. That is what, national organizations refer to homelessness being a lagging indicator. And that's what that means. It's like when the economy goes in the tank, it takes at least a year for homelessness to go up. And the opposite is true as well, that when the economy gets better, it typically takes at least a year for us to see a decline in homelessness. So there are wheels being put in motion right now that are going to lead to people being homeless a year and a half from now.
Thank you for that insight. Did you have any other questions, Gerard?
Yeah, I have one final follow-up. So
Sure.
It almost seems like if someone gets evicted, instead of going from a friends and a family, they might want to kind of reach out or try to find shelter in a homeless place a little bit sooner instead of waiting till some of these resources dry up. Is that accurate?
Well, the main thing that I would recommend, locally, we have something called the Central Access Point, or CAP, we call it for short. It's a helpline that people can call for information. The phone number is 381-SAFE. 381, I think that's 7233. That's the CAP line. I would always recommend people call the CAP line as early as possible. That is where we identify people for the prevention resources that we do have. And it's also how people can find out about a homeless shelter that could accommodate them. But if they want to get into one of the prevention services we do have, or get into that capacity that we do have, the way they would do that is by calling the Central Access Point. What the people answering the phone at CAP are going to want to do is talk to them about, how much longer do they have a couch they could sleep on. They're always trying to target resources at people whose situation is sort of the most desperate, the people who are closest to being homeless. So the conversation would all be about sort of, without help, when would you find yourself on the street or in a shelter? But then that's how you get connected to resources that might help you not end up in a shelter or on the street.
Gotcha. I am sharing the screen right now for information about the Central Access Point, Help for Homelessness.
Yes.
And we'll be sure to share this link right here as well.
That would be great.
Okay, perfect.
Just as sort of a sidebar, the Central Access Point that runs out of my office. That's as close as we come. I mentioned that we're sort of a behind the scenes organization. The closest we come to being direct service is that we operate that helpline. So that is my staff, my people answering the phone. So, and they do a great job of trying to connect people to the resources they need.
Okay. Perfect. Well, yeah, I can. So Kevin, I want to thank you so much for allowing me to accept my reach out to you to have you join us on here to talk about this very serious, important issue. Very, very great. My heart is warm because I know that someone will see this and want to move to action, and hopefully we can get more people to move to action.
I appreciate you guys. I appreciate you guys having me on, because again, that idea of homeless people not being what most people assume, if even one person learned that from listening to the three of us today, then that was a good use of an hour. So
exactly.
I appreciate you guys having me on.
Yes. And so next week, following kind of right along, we're going to have Janice Jones from Housing Opportunities Made Equal. She is the president, CEO, executive director of Home. Next week, she'll be on to discuss the housing and eviction process. As we know, there's been a lot of discussion with the city, the county about evictions and what's going to happen there, that they've been essentially put on pause right now. But as we continue to open up the economy,
unfortunately, they're going to be starting up again soon, unfortunately.
Exactly. So she's going to get on and talk more about that as well. I almost invited her to come on today, but I know it works in tandem, but I know that's another discussion as well.
I love Janice. I would have minded being on with Janice, but she's
Well, Kevin, I would if you
Actually,
wanna...
she might have made me look stupid if she'd been on at the same time as me. So
No.
just as well that she's on separately.
So Kevin, thank you so much. I appreciate all the great work that you do. I know myself and Gerard, we're definitely going to do a little type up and make a post on our social medias to share among our constituents so that they can be more informed about the things that we talked about today. Is there any final things you wanted to add, Gerard?
No.
Besides thanking Kevin?
Nah, other than thanking Kevin, man, I just appreciate you, man. So I appreciate you for coming out, Kevin, for sure.
Yes.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So thank you all. That's this week of the discussion. We're looking for it on YouTube. Kevin, I'll be able to share it if you want to share it as well. That would be amazing.
We will. We definitely will.
Thank you all. Look forward to the discussion next week. All right. Enjoy.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.